Welcome to episode 6 of Word Made Digital. I'm your host, Joanna LaFleur, and on this episode, we're talking to Kevin Makins. He is the founding pastor of Eucharist Church. It's in downtown Hamilton, Ontario, here in Canada, and he works on all kinds of side projects as well. He does writing and podcasts. He makes a ton of videos on YouTube. He's a bit of a YouTube pastor, YouTube vlogger, and he does some touring of these one-man shows talking about faith and life as we find it today in 2018. So he's an interesting guy to talk to. I think you're really going to enjoy the conversation because his context for his church is all focused on artists. His church is looking at how to reach artists in their urban community. He feels like in their particular context, it's a community of people that hasn't been well reached or well connected into the church communities that already exist. And so their church plan was trying to reach out to artists. So we have a very interesting and diverse and meandering conversation about art and the church. I think you're really going to enjoy the conversation, but now just a little bit of a note, depending on who's listening. I want you to know that Kevin has some colorful language at times, shall we say, and I want my guests to feel like they are represented in the way that they came across by choice. And so I'm not editing out the way he talks, but I want you to know there's some language in here, and so you can decide if you want to continue from here. You have been warned. It's not too bad, but I just want you to know before we dive in today. You're going to enjoy the conversation with Kevin. We met face to face, so it's just a dynamic, energetic conversation about art and the church, and he has some really interesting things to say as a church planter in an urban context about how art is reaching people. So I can't wait to dive into this conversation with you and with Kevin. Thanks so much for listening, for sharing, and for checking out this episode of the Word Made Digital podcast. And so here we go, Kevin Makins.
You're listening to the Word Made Digital podcast with Joanna LaFleur, where we discuss all things creative and communications for the church. The church carries the best news in the world, so we want to help you be the best creatives and communicators in the world. Let's go.
Well, hi, Kevin.
Oh, hi. Hello.
Welcome.
I'm not on my phone.
Welcome to the podcast.
It's so different from the rest of regular life.
I know. Well,
here.
We've been hanging out for a while already. We ate the shawarma. We're hanging out in another guy's studio, and it's crazy hot today. But here we are. I want to have this conversation with you. I've been looking forward to this, and I'd like people to get to know you. So let's just start there. Who are you? Give us your bio.
Hi, I'm Kevin. I'm currently trying to figure out where to put my glass so it doesn't do this. So that's way too loud.
It's done.
Hello, Internet. My name's Kevin. I am a pastor in a city called Hamilton, Ontario, which if you're from Ontario, you probably know about. Don't be scared. We're nice. I church planted a church in Hamilton 8 years ago called Eucharist Church. And since then, we have been hanging out downtown Hamilton. We moved down here about 10 years ago, and then we church planted 8 years ago. And since the beginning of that, we've had this focus on creativity and the arts and trying to think about new angles on things and how to create work together as a congregation and as a community, as well as how to empower people in our community to make really good kingdom work, whether that's video, art installations, whether that's other kinds of creative work, street murals, music, or whatever it is.
Yeah. So I wanted
fashion.
Yeah.
No, we don't have any fashion.
Well, I don't know.
If you're
maybe.
a fashion Jesus-loving person, come hang out with us. We don't know fashion.
I know a few of those people.
Really?
In Toronto, probably less of that in Hamilton than in.
Don't you judge us?
In a larger city, but
don't know.
I don't know. You're right. I'm enjoying hanging out in Hamilton today. This is a cool city.
It is. It's a funky little.
And
place.
I'd like to go into that a little bit later in our conversation about what's happening in the city with gentrification, or is it gentrification? All that kind of stuff. But so. Starting out, you're talking about, you started this church. Why did you start this church? How did you become a Christian? Where did this come? Yeah, give me a bit of context.
Okay. So a bit of context. I was raised in the church. I was raised Lutheran, in this little Lutheran church up on the escarpment in Hamilton, and there were no other young Christians in my church. So when I was in high school, anyone that had come to VBS or any of that stuff, they all kind of dropped off the map. And it was me and my sister and my two cousins, and I didn't know any other Christians, period.
Wow.
Like, I went to public school. None of my friends from school went to church. So I thought the future of the entire faith rested on our 4 little shoulders. Because I just didn't know that there were other Christians. And then I met some kids when I was in high school, like some people from my school on the beach. And there were these 3 girls there, and they were all cuties. And they turned out they were Christians, and they weren't just like any kind of Christian. They were these Pentecostal, praise Jesus, like hardcore, full of the Spirit people. Yeah. And I was like, oh my goodness, what is this? And I tried to like impress them with catechism, and it just didn't work. And I was like, oh my gosh.
Does catechism ever work as like
I don't know.
pickup line?
Some Anglicans should mail in and tell us if it does. I don't know. I thought that this would impress these girls, and it didn't at all. And they invited me to youth group. And I was like, oh my gosh, youth group, I don't know about this. I was in grade 12 at the time. Kind of resisted it, but then the one that I had a big crush on invited me, and I was like, I'll be there. And so I ended up going to this youth group, and when I was there, I met people who were showing me what it looked like to follow Jesus. Not as a 50-year-old, which was fine. Like, I wasn't anti my faith I'd been raised in.
Right.
And I had learned so much about the Bible, but it was all very non-personal, or at least inaccessible for me at that time. And so going to this youth group and seeing kids who were 16, 17, 18 following Jesus was like, oh, you can do this now. I didn't know that. And so that threw me into this world of church and kind of activated like all this Bible knowledge and all this kind of depth that I had been handed my whole life kind of became personalized and activated when I was in that space. And so that's where really my faith came alive.
Wow.
And I had fallen in love with downtown Hamilton a couple summers earlier.
I thought you were going to say a girl, but no, you've moved on from that girl.
No, that girl and we held hands once, and then it was over. But, thanks, Jesus, for bait and switching me on that one. It's what he does. If any guys are listening to this, they know it's Jesus is like, here's a girl. And you're like, yes. And then you get close enough, he's like, kidding, it's me, Jesus. And you're like, oh, damn it. Am I allowed to swear, by the way? What are the rules on this?
You be you.
Okay, I'll be me, you be you. And you're like, oh, Jesus, that's not a girl at all. That's the Lord. But that's a good thing, Yeah. So really, that's where my faith came alive and became very personal. I fell in love with downtown Hamilton around that time, working at a summer camp, and loved the grit of the city. Yeah. Like, I was raised in the suburbs, and no knock against the suburbs. They're great suburbs. But culture isn't necessarily accessible in some of those spaces. Like, I was raised that every outdoor like shopping mall, like every kind of plaza center was the same. It was just the same 15 shops kind of rolled randomly into parking lots, and
the Walmart parking lot.
Yeah, and they all kind of look interchangeable. I could drive to Pickering, I could drive 6 hours north to Ottawa, I could go to over east, and they were all the same.
Yeah.
And then I'd go downtown, and it was like scary, and there were like smashed bottles everywhere, and people that looked different from me, but there was also street art, and there were people in the skate park there. They were doing skate jams, and there was musicians on the side of the road and little bars that had bands playing. And I just remember being in high school being like, oh my goodness, you can do this? Like, look at this, what is this? And I didn't feel safe, but I felt alive. And so I really fell in love with the kind of honest grit of a good city at that point.
And would you have described yourself as a creative person? Like were you an artistic? As a kid, were you an artistic kid, or I don't know, music or theater or?
I've only started digging into this because like lately I've realized in the last couple of years, like, oh, I'm a creative person. Like, I create things. Like, I've done a one-man show called Holy Shift. I make YouTube videos every week. I've written a book that I'm working on publishing right now. And, you're kind of like, oh, I do creative things. Where did this all come from?
Right. So it's sort of been a natural progression, it sounds like.
Well, what's interesting is like when I was really little, yes, I would have absolutely been your little creative weirdo. When I was a kid and you had the card of like, what do you want to be when you grow up? I said I wanted to be a literary publisher or something like insane. Something I probably heard once on TV and was like, that sounds nice. Yeah. Like, I wanted to work in books, which is so funny. And my first book was called Sesame Street's on Fire. There was some intellectual property issues, but it was this, epic story of Sesame Street being on fire. I would make my own comic books, and I would at the back, I'd have a little letters to the editor section where my mom's friends would just write on the paper itself a question to the editor, who was me, who did everything because these were little comics I made.
Yeah.
And I'd respond, "Thanks so much, Diva, for writing in. I'll let you know what's up with the adventures next month," And so I had this weird life. And what's fascinating is I was really, really bullied in middle school.
Okay.
Like horribly bullied. Went home from school, in air quotes, sick, a lot bullied.
Wow. Yeah.
And so I was this really weird creative kid. Me and my best friend Dan would record what now we would call podcasts. We recorded Kevin's Farm, which was a live action skit show where we played all the animals and farmers, and we made radio shows and board games. We were really creative kids.
Yeah.
But I was bullied so much that I just really receded from ever doing that publicly. So I would never speak in front of people. I would never make a joke. I would never want to be in front of anyone, which is hilarious now because I'm always in front of lots of people now. And I would constantly just kind of pull back. I remember a good example is when I was in middle school, I didn't want to wear a shirt that had a logo on it because what if somebody looked at me? So what I did one day when the only shirt that was clean was a shirt with a logo on it is I flipped the shirt inside out.
Wow.
Thinking, oh, now no one will think I'm weird, like if I had a logo on my shirt. I'll just wear this inside out shirt and I'm sure nobody will notice that that's way weirder than a logo. So I just had this fear. And what's fascinating is when I went to high school, I switched out of the stream of public school that I was going to be in, applied for this specialty school, got in, and when I went there, I had older friends, and I went from being picked on every day to being very popular immediately. And when that happened, I lost all this creative edge. I stopped making art. It's
like you need that artistic angst.
I just needed a little bit of angst. I wasn't goth enough to be an artist. I just lost a lot of the creative edge and leaned into the social edge. I could get in front of people. I could talk. I could make friends. So it was really fascinating when I became a Christian. I've only kind of dug through this more recently. Really, these worlds started coming together.
Right. So that's what I was curious about.
I was invited to a youth group. Do you want to tell a story? I got to preach my first sermon. And suddenly it was there's this social life of a youth group. I love youth groups. I think they're amazing.
The social aspect of you and this creative aspect could come together.
Totally. Because youth groups are always making weird stuff. We need someone to make a banner. Let's tell a story. Let's do, make some games up, lead games. And so I think, for me, I know many people have negative experiences of youth group, and there were elements of our youth group that I don't think were the best because it was we're a bunch of people. But one of the things it really gifted me with was this space where I could both be social and a weirdo. And it gave me a grounding narrative of the Christian faith that suddenly gave me something deeper to swim in than just my 17-year-old ideas.
Right.
So it was your 17-year-old ideas are great.
Yeah.
That's fine. But also, let's talk about this long history of death and resurrection and faith and tradition and innovation. And so for me, really, faith and the church is where these streams came together.
Yeah. And so from the beginning, the church, Eucharist Church,
yes,
was art, when you envisioned for this church, maybe you were in seminary or, I don't know, Bible school, or you got married somewhere along the way. I don't know where your wife, who was not from your youth group.
She's an art, she did an art degree at university.
Oh, okay, so
she
another
was an
artist.
Yeah.
And so it sounds like maybe from the very beginning, perhaps, in the vision of church for you, art was going to be part of that.
Yeah, the big vision for us with the church was we wanted to create a church community that would reach people in our city, that had a firm kind of geography, but would reach people in our city on the edge of faith. And so some of those people were people who had been pushed out of the church, socially economic, maybe pushed out of the church, LGBTQ people who had felt pushed out of the church. And so we had all these people that we wanted to connect with, people that, and we had talked with the other churches in our city and told them about this and got their blessing. So it wasn't it wasn't us critiquing existing churches. It was just us saying no church can be everything. Yeah. And so if there are congregations that reach a lot of the people in our city, who are the people that aren't finding a space in church communities? Who are the people that are leaving church communities? And is it just because they don't want to be in the church? Or is it that they would have to, and I'm quoting now Nadia Bolz-Weber, they would have to culturally commute to be a part of our church. Right. They'd have to dress differently, talk differently, act differently in order to socially belong in a space. Yeah. And so we knew there were a lot of churches reaching a lot of people who God loves. Yeah. But there was some people who weren't finding homes in these congregations. And one of those groups is artists. That artists are inherently skeptical. They see the world from the underside. They have humor, and they're maybe a little too skeptical at points, and they're weird, and they'll do insane things that are not safe in church around children. And
You're like light things on fire or
yeah,
something?
and I was like, that sounds awesome.
Yeah.
What if we could make a church? And at that time, I wouldn't have even called myself an artist or anything like that at that point. I was just a preacher. But I knew that we needed a church where those people's gifts could not only be welcomed, but could come alive. Where they were put at the center of the life that we have together.
So I want to talk about how that translates in a moment. I want to talk about this new building and how that works out. But talk to me about, I think in other conversations you've had with people, I think it's from the outside looking in. They use words like Hipster Church. They're going to use words like
super hip. It's important for everyone watching this.
I mean, they don't know.
Picture the hippest guy you can think of, and that's me. I'm wearing all leather right now.
I mean, I did just see you go around on a one-wheel skateboard.
That is true.
I mean, that's kind of cool. But okay, so there's this let's talk about the millennial thing.
Sure.
And I'm bringing this up not actually because. I grow a little weary of the conversation, partly because millennials are actually quite old now.
Yeah, we are old people with children and responsibilities.
But I bring it up because I think some people listening are older than millennials.
Sure.
And they're still asking this question: how do we reach millennials? Millennials or Gen Z?
And younger people, Gen Z. How do we reach people?
And I think what they really mean is how do we reach young people?
Sure.
I mean, millennials are a unique group, but there's lots of subsections within it, blah, blah, blah. So how do you respond to that idea of millennials, hipster church, this sort of how people describe what's happening at your church?
I think that the creative question actually comes double helixes a bit with this, which is I think that people that feel distant from the church are often, not always, but are often people who feel like they'd have to check part of themselves to be a part of a church community. That they have to, and this is a buzzword, but it's a good word, they'd have to become inauthentic.
Okay.
And really, as buzzwordy as the word authentic is, it's as bad as like relevant or whatever other cool words we've got. It really is important for people that they know what they're saying is, does Jesus welcome me as the hot mess I really am? Or do I have to pretend a little bit to belong? And young people have no patience for games.
Right.
Maybe not all young people. Maybe some people do. But young people that I know in
like an over-marketed, over-advertised... overly advertised saturation society.
Yeah, if you're trying to
people
sell
can see
something,
through the sale.
They can smell the bullshit right away.
Yeah.
They can smell it. And if you are like, no offense to anyone listening, and if you're like, oh my gosh, bullshit, that word makes you shiver. I use that language because that is just the way normal humans talk that aren't Christian subculture. And it's not scandalous. Don't take the Lord's name in vain. Don't curse people. But they can smell when it's politeness. And we're saying it's Christianity, but really it's Western politeness and middle-class values. And they can smell that. Now, they don't always know how to articulate that particularly well, and they don't always have a new option, right? There's a lot of deconstruction that people do without necessarily reconstructing something. So I'm not saying that everyone who's ever been critical of Christian institutions is valid. I work for a Christian institution and I love it. But we have to figure out how do we let people be authentically 100% who they are and believe that God blesses them as they are, and that it's God's blessing that does any work in us. It's God's grace that does work in us, not our try harder, do more, spiritually self-improved culture that we can live in. Yeah. And I think that when it comes to young people, that is, if we've done anything to reach young people, which, we have been blessed to see young people come in. And if we've done anything to reach people that have dropped out of the church or never been to church before, which are kind of two of the big doors we have, it is saying even the culture around you, like in our downtown context here of our city, even our culture won't accept people in the mess of their life, right? Like there's a certain amount of game playing that you do in every social setting, in every bar, in every restaurant, in every spot. And what if the church could be the one place in town that says our God is so generous in his welcome and his grace and his love and his embrace that you can come in exactly as you are. You check none of yourself at the door. And it doesn't mean that everything in you is good, but it means that everything in you is beloved. Like you are fully beloved. And that any change that God does is not going to be you working harder, but it's going to be you accepting the radical love and challenge of God.
Yeah. I'd like to hear a story. I'm sure you're a preacher, so you got to have stories.
I've never told us. Yeah.
So, I mean, something like from a previous time we hung out, I've said this to you before, but for the sake of this audience, I say it again. Something that most impressed me in my first impression of you was that when you walk down the streets of Hamilton, like, you know people by name, and other people know you by name. Like, you're walking down the street with Kevin, and everybody's saying, hey. Like, I'm like, I feel like I'm with like some quote unquote, I'm with like a local celebrity, or you feel like you're not a politician. That sounds slimy, but people
it's like
know.
A beat cop
people
for Jesus.
Yeah, you're a beat cop. People know and like you in the local pub, in the coffee shop, in the sandwich place. Like we had a meal together, and you were going to other tables to go say hi to people around the restaurant. And, And I don't mean it in the slimy way, but it's the politician working the room in the best of ways.
Well,
actually,
it's the Parish Collective is a group out of Seattle. They have a book called The New Parish, which is quite good if you're interested in local ministry and parish life.
What's the name of the book? Say it again.
Oh, The New Parish.
The New Parish.
Yeah, which is the idea that our faith is rooted in place, which is a very high value for me and for Eucharist. I mean, most of our church would come in from no more than 3 kilometers in any direction.
Wow.
A 6K stretch is 95% of our congregation.
Yeah, it's a very like densified.
Yeah, we have no parking because most people can bike in. And, you are welcome to come if you're beyond that, but you should know you're entering a parish. This is where, and we're going to invite you to either move here or to be a part of this, but you will feel a bit of distance because we can't be everything everywhere all the time. This is the lie of the digital age. We can be all things everywhere all the time.
Yeah.
And so, we really, and I personally really value, find your neighborhood. What can you do in your own backyard? Because that's something you can actually handle. And so, when I walk down the...
That sounds hard already.
Yeah. Oh, not...
But I know what you mean.
Yeah, and by handle I simply mean their language of the new parish is you become a character in your neighborhood. So you get to know the characters of your neighborhood, right? The guy with the really little dog, the woman who always collects the bottles from our front of our house, you know, all these characters.
Yeah.
And then you become a character.
Yeah.
So I am the pastor. Like, that's my character. And I have bar owners that are smoking cigarettes outside of the bar that will stop me and say, "Oh, Kevin, can you and I pray about something?"
Yeah.
And they're not going to church. They just, but they know that that's my character. That's who I am.
So tell us about, speaking of the characters, tell us a story about like an artist in the community that, or a creative, maybe not literally an artist, but a creative type of person that's connected in with...
Who's a part of our church?
Yeah, who's a part of the church. Or maybe not, but they have passed through your ministry.
That's a good question.
I mean, we're sitting, like, for example, we're sitting right now. I mean, maybe this is less of a story, because I know I've heard stories of impact in ministry that you have, but we're sitting in the studio of some creative types.
Yeah, some people from our community who are very creative.
Yeah, but I feel like, again, like, I can't recall your stories, but I know you've told me stories of sort of difficult, challenging, broken types of people who've connected.
Part of the reason I'm hesitating is because I value people's stories, as their pastor.
Yeah, fair enough.
And that's okay. It just means you might have to wait a second, audience. While I think about a story that would be...
Shareable,
that I have some permission to share. From artists. Okay, why don't I tell you a story about an art project we did that I think captures the same idea. So this is this event in downtown Hamilton called Art Crawl. And it's this big event. Thousands of people come out, about 50,000 people every second Friday of the month. And then there's Super Crawl, which is in the fall, and that's like 100,000 people, just this huge events. And did I say 50,000 people? I think it's more like 20,000 people every week. Whatever.
Lots of people.
No one's going to Google this. You don't know, audience. Why am I apologizing to you? Sorry, Joanna, I'm breaking the fourth wall here. So we had, in our church, we wanted to do some sort of public art piece that would engage the city in a bigger conversation. So this was early on in Eucharist. We took photos of 70 people in our church. And they were standing in a saint pose with the kind of hand up. Yeah. And behind their head were these big golden halos. And then on their hands was blood. And we called the piece Saints and Sinners. And then we wheat pasted it along this big fence. We got permission from the fence owner, right in the middle of Art Crawl. 60 pictures of 60 people, all of whom live in the lower city, who have halos behind their heads, are standing like saints, and there's blood dripping off of their hands. And then there was a little description next to it that just said there's this idea in the Christian faith of being simultaneously sinner and saint. That we are, none of us are exclusively saint, none of us are exclusively sinner. And we believe the way of Jesus teaches us how to become saints. But that doesn't mean that we are without, fault. It's just kind of this little write-up about the tension of being human. And it was just a design piece to kind of start conversation. We had no idea if anyone would look at it, but people did look at it.
Wow.
Because it was huge. I mean, these were each poster size, 60 poster size images. And people were stopping, like thousands of people, and looking at it and looking at these pictures and talking about it. But then what was fascinating is somebody would say, hey, wait a minute, that's my barista. Right? And someone was like, hey, yeah.
These are the characters.
She's in that band, you know? And people started being like, oh, this weird art thing by this weird Eucharist, Eucharist Church. These are people that we know. And so it ended up sparking conversations for a lot of artists in our church. People said it was our church's coming out party. It was all these people who were like, I've been secretly closeted Christian all this time. I've been nervous to tell people because people in cities like ours don't have the best view of Christians quite often.
Yeah.
But it was this kind of, hi, yes, I do follow Jesus and I'm a part of a church. And, this art was a way to represent that for the city. And so those kinds of spaces have been projects that I really respect. I mean, I could tell you about collaborative art projects we've done. We had a student come up from Ottawa who did a placement. We've done artist in residency programs for a couple of summers where we'll bring an artist up and they'll stay with somebody in the church and we'll get them a bike and they move to downtown Hamilton for 12 weeks and they make art. They make one final art project. And I have a reading list for them. They meet with artists like my friend Shad, who's an amazing rapper and a follower of Jesus. Like he'd come down and meet with them. Like we just had this amazing opportunity. And we had one student who she was actually in Abbotsford, and then she came here. Now she's in Ottawa. And she did this art piece called Skin of a City where she did these portraits of buildings on the inside of birch bark and talked about how birch bark is a detoxifying tree and it sucks the toxins out of an environment, And we had two other artists, including one, Meredith Park, who's one of my housemates and a part of our church, and you should talk to her. She's probably the best illustrator I know. Wow. She's incredible. Playground Park is her name on Instagram if anybody's looking it up. Or maybe Meredith Park. Look it up, you'll find it. She has amazing illustrations, and she moved up here from Annapolis, outside of Baltimore, and ended up now living. She lives with my wife and I, and we have 3 housemates. She's one of them. And they did this final art show where inside of a church building, they made a house. And they talked about our relationship between shared spaces and public spaces and our relationship with our bodies. And so her and this other woman, who the 2 artists in residence that year, did this huge art installation where the bedroom was in the sanctuary, and this big old sanctuary at the front in the narthex was a bed, and they had their clothes on hangers in the middle of the space, and they had TVs on static in the parlor of the church. And so, we've tried to create space where we can work on things together. We did a Mass for the End of the World, which was an apocalypse-themed gathering, and a Christmas apocalypse service once where we made this huge art piece about a Christmas tree destroying tank tread length credit card teeth monster that tore through Christmas and destroyed it. So we've done a lot of weird stuff. But for me, it's about not how do we do something cool. It's really about how do the arts help us get to ideas that if we sit down and we lecture you on them, it's not going to work. I love installation art. That's been one of the kind of mediums we've played in the most. How do we get people to go and look at art, walk into a room that's set up in a certain kind of way, and allow the room to preach something good to them or to reveal something, which is what apocalyptic is, right? Apocalypse is revealing. That's what the word apocalypse means. And so how do we use art to make Christmas apocalyptic? In that case, how do we reveal the consumerism and capitalism that threatens Christmas as a spiritual event? And how do we use the arts to apocalyptically pull back the veil and say, hey, are we really celebrating Jesus here, or are we worshiping some other beast?
Right.
And the arts do a great job because they can talk to the city about that, and people in the city don't have to be Christians. They just have to be people who want to engage with art.
Right.
And now the ideas of our faith and the real meat of our faith, the depth of it, can come to light through this art. Or people in our church can grow in their faith by working on art. That art might be the natural way that they engage with God. We have a musician who's just an incredible musician in our church, and he's dyslexic. So he doesn't read much because he finds it difficult, and he finds it hard to listen to long sermons, and I preach long sermons sometimes. And so for him, he'll say, when he makes music is how he interacts with God. That's how he worships. And he did once he did music through a whole sermon. So it was a spoken word sermon where he played music that worked with the words in the sermon. Yeah. And he said, that was for him this way of him preaching.
It was an act of worship for him.
Yeah, there was 3 musicians that we were doing the Temptation of Jesus of the Wilderness, and they did music to accompany it. But just that ability to experiment. And if we fail, whatever, who cares? It's not a show. Church isn't a show.
Well, so
let's
say
try
something
things.
about that, because what we're talking about, it's a long game. It's not we did an art show and now our church has increased by 5%.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Attendance.
You want to be disappointed with the arts? Make them utilitarian. They will fail you immediately. If it's like, what's the ROI on the Apocalypse Christmas? It's just not. They're not that useful.
Yeah.
The arts, much like preaching, right? Like I'm a pastor. I preach. You don't say, did that sermon grow the church? Did that sermon increase the giving? As soon as you make preaching utilitarian, you've just created propaganda. You're no longer sharing good news. You're sharing something that is designed to make people do something. And so in the same way, the arts has to be something that we think are inherently valuable.
Yeah.
And part of the beautiful thing about being people who believe in God and who believe in worship is that if you do an art show and nobody shows up, at least it's for God.
Yeah, that's true.
This is you gotta.
It's the prize is in the making and the doing.
It's in the pursuit.
It's not in the accolades, the award, the measuring of butts and seats.
You have 500 people show up for an art show. You've had your reward in full.
Yeah.
Right? The whole world sees it. People cheer you on. You put a video online and you get 20,000 people to watch it. Well, there you go. There's your reward. You get all this attention and thumbs up. It's and likes. And it's not evil. I find Jesus, when he says that, you've got your reward in full when you preach in front of people or stand on the corners. I don't think he's condemning it. I think he's just saying,
that's it.
You should know what you get.
Yeah.
You got it. Congratulations. But if you really want a life of depth with God that is living in the kingdom of God, the art itself has to be meaningful, even if it's just for God.
Yeah.
If it's just for you and God, and that's your act of worship.
Yeah.
And if 50,000 people listen to your song, or 50 million people, there's nothing evil about it, but it's changed a little bit. And you can offer that up to God, and that's not condemned. But there's a certain kind of beauty that's in the making.
Yeah.
And whenever we make art, what will we get from it?
Yeah.
I make YouTube videos. So every week is this, you post it and you watch in real time how successful or how much of a failure a video is.
Yeah. So let's talk about that.
So that's,
tell me about YouTube.
Oh, YouTube.
So
we are jumping all over the place.
Yeah, why not? Yeah. You have a YouTube channel. Mm-hmm. I don't know, would you call yourself a YouTuber? Pastor? A YouTuber?
No, I would not.
Vlogger?
I would say...
What do you call yourself in that medium?
I am a pastor who makes YouTube videos.
Okay.
I'm not a videographer. Sitting in my friend Jesse's studio right now. Sometimes we'll make videos together, and those are really pretty because he's a videographer. I don't care if my videos are particularly pretty. I hope that they're visually interesting. But, I'm a storyteller. So that's that.
So
the
tell
words
us, because people haven't seen your videos. What kind of a
Everyone
video?
here hasn't seen my videos.
Sorry, not yet.
They are
not until they hear.
when
this
your
podcast.
pastor makes a church illustration, he holds up a little water bottle and he's like, "My daughter brought this to me." They're just those, but on the internet for 5 minutes. They are okay. So here's why I started it. I wanted to find a way to share what we've learned as a church. So I said before, I value local above pretty much everything. So locally, as a pastor of a church, that is top priority. And if we're not living this out within our 5-6 kilometers, then there's no message. It's just showboating. It's just trying to impress people. But if we're living something out here together as a local church, there may be an overflow. And that overflow may be useful to others. I only knew we could church plant because I read books when I was in college and seminary about church planting and was like, wait, you can church plant? That's allowed? So we need people to share things. We do.
Yeah.
But we need people to share things that are true and that are rooted and are good. Because if it's just people sharing things because they're, they want to share things, you might be sharing something bad or something that hasn't been practiced and lived. So we had this reflection of, we've been living stuff for 8 years. Maybe we can start talking about some of those things because we've been living it locally. And so for me, that is what YouTube ended up becoming, was could we share here just reflections on life? It might be personal, it might be congregational, but things that are from our city, from our church, kind of things we've learned. And can they just be little reflections that welcome people into some idea and give them enough to chew on it, but ultimately kind of push them back now into their own spaces? The end goal isn't come watch more of my YouTube videos. The end goal is find some local people and chat about this. Find some local people and put this into practice yourselves in your own context.
What's a video that you've done lots of videos. I know you've been like really consistent in the last 6 months or so.
Good Word Wednesday is what they're called now.
Good
so
Word
every Wednesday a new one drops.
You've been doing this for a while.
Yeah, about a year and a half.
And what's a video that or maybe it's one you did with Jesse, I don't know, but what's a video that you love or that's really you feel like connected with people? Or
the third video we did, so my favorite videos are always collaborative. I make videos every week now because it's enjoyable and it builds like a steady group of people who are engaged, but the making side of things is never more enjoyable than when Jesse, who I think you're going to interview in another episode, like we're just really good friends and we could stay up really late. We did this one video called The Waiting Challenge about social media and cell phones and waiting during Advent. And we shot it in a back alley just around the corner from where we are here. And then we were like, this really, we need to bring the story. There was a story about Elijah in it. We need to bring this to light. So we got a guy, Jared, from our church, who's a good friend of ours as well. And we worked on a stop motion animation till 4 a.m. And then Jesse and I will sit up for the next night till 5, 6 a.m. and edit it. And that to me is like, that's a gift, right? We did this show Holy Shift.
Because you're doing it, it's the doing it together.
It's sitting around and editing and working on it. And I love YouTube videos that I make on my own too. And I actually like staying up late and I'll come and work with some friends. But the collaborative stuff for me is really the dream of it. When can you find somebody who your gifts work better together than they do independently?
Yeah.
And so for me, it is important that people, maybe if they know I'm a pastor, which I think most people would pick up pretty quickly in a YouTube video, I'm not their pastor.
Yeah.
And I've said this before, like, I'm not your pastor because I don't know you. I can't love you like you should love each other or like your pastor should love you. I want to share ideas to help you find flesh and blood people. And my hope with this network of YouTube videos is that as it grows, people will start writing from the same places and that it can just be a medium for people to find other people who want to shape communities or join communities or strengthen communities.
Yeah.
And my hope is that it maybe shares what we're learning here. Same with the book I've been working on. Shares our story so that you can say what I said when I was in college and doing seminary. Like, wait, you can do this? You can rebirth an old church. You can bring the arts into the center of a community. You can be recklessly honest.
Yeah.
You can start new communities. Yes, you can.
Yeah.
You can do all these things.
Yeah.
And so if we can share our story from the overflow and inspire people to grab their own thing and run with it, that's the dream.
Yeah. So you have this art expression, a medium of the city of Hamilton as a canvas, if you will. And you have YouTube as another canvas to paint on.
One very
explore.
local and one explicitly as far as you can imagine.
Yeah. And then talk to us for a few minutes about you just got a church building.
We did. We bought a building.
And
it might be a terrible idea.
Well, yeah, so tell us about that. Obviously, it's a huge shift. It's a huge culture change for your church community. But talk to us about the church building, because you're getting it. You are renovating an old church, so
it's 125 years old.
Yeah, it's a canvas now for you for art and expression of the good news of Jesus.
Yep.
So what's your dreams for that? What do you want to do there?
So we had some here's a funny story. So we had this like meeting in it. We had the whole congregation come, and we're a congregation of 1 to 150 adults. And we had the congregation come to the building, and we were going to talk about the building. Should we buy this building together? And I kind of threw out these ideas. I was like, what if it wasn't just a building for church? What if it was a center for faith and for justice and for the arts? And I threw up this big image, and I'm like, in the middle is our building and our hub. And around this hub are all the partnerships we've had in the last 10 years. And yet there are more. Here are other partnerships we could have. And we've had Fringe in here, the arts group. And we had a recording studio in the basement. And then we had all these arts things and creative things and justice mobilization for the neighborhood committees who could meet here. And this network of churches could come and use this, and another church here in the afternoons, and all these things. And I looked out afterwards. I was like, that's a vision for the building. And I looked around just expecting everyone to be like, yay, let's do it. And I turned around and everyone just looked overwhelmed. Yeah. Like everyone just looked so overwhelmed.
You'd had a few more espressos than that.
They were just like deer in headlights staring like, you insane man. Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, I have over-visioned and I have under-listened.
Huh.
That I came in thinking I knew what this should be, because I think I know what everything should be, because I'm an idiot. And so I'm half joking. I just thought I knew what this should be. And I don't think I'm wrong. I think it's a great vision. But they were saying, we don't even know what this building is. Yeah. We don't know who we are in a building. We just need to decide, should we buy this building and take it from there? Enough of your over-visioning. We just need to decide, should we grab this responsibility?
Step right in front of us versus the leader, the visionary who's dreaming 10 years down the road.
Yeah, and it's okay to have those visions, but you've got to actually, it can't be my vision, it has to be God's vision for us, and that's going to require some listening as well. And so we ended up doing a recommendation. The board recommended that we buy it, and then we said we need a vote on it, that we need to know if the whole congregation can get behind this. So we said, if we don't have 80% affirmation of buying this building. I mean, it's an affordable building of an old church space right downtown in our city on one of the major roads in the city that we would never get back if it became condos. So we just kind of laid that out. And we said, we need a vote. And we ended up having 101 people voted, kind of said, I'm committed for the long haul with this church. And they voted, and we got back 101 affirmations.
Wow.
It was a completely unanimous vote.
Wow.
And so for me, that was what made me say we should buy this building. It's not enough that it's my vision or even our leadership's vision. It had to be owned by the community.
Right.
And if it wasn't owned by the community, it would be us trying to take people somewhere instead of God taking all of us somewhere. And so we ended up deciding to go ahead and purchase the building. And we got a lot of people saying to us right off the bat, we called people we know who do great mission work out of their buildings. And they all said, take a year to do almost nothing. Take a year to just see what the building is.
Yeah. Live in the quote unquote bare bones.
Just live in it.
Yeah.
See, it's like trying to push water up a hill, right? Like you're like, I'm getting it. Like, no, you're not. I'm getting one drip. Get up the hill. But if you instead say, where's the water flow?
Yeah.
And how do we work with the natural flow of this building?
What's trying to happen?
What is the building trying to do?
Yeah.
What has God been doing? What has God been doing in the space of the last 125 years? What does the kingdom look like in this neighborhood and in this city and with this community? And so the first thing we did in the building, we took out the windows, the old stained glass windows, to have them repaired.
They're going back though.
They're going back in. Yeah. They just cost a lot of money. And if anybody wants to donate money, you can go to eucharistchurch.ca because we need to raise $500,000 before December 2018.
Yeah.
So, you can hop on there. We would I'll come hang out with you and talk. I'll pitch the vision. I got it. But yeah, it's a lot. But what was cool is we had to board up the windows in the meantime. And it was like, who wants to have Easter Sunday, our first service, in a building with no windows?
Like not just no windows, like boarded up windows. Yeah, it looks like it's condemned or
I was
something.
just like, this sucks. But then we had this kind of scrappy artist idea of, what if we would actually wheat paste, glue up posters along the inside of this window and made a big image. And so one of the artists in our church drew this beautiful image of Jesus, Mary, and Martha walking in the garden with bread and wine post-resurrection. And she broke it down into pieces. And another artist in our church, another artist did the breakdown, another one picked the colors. And they ended up making this massive paint by number, 30-foot high paint by number. And we had about 70 people in our church contribute to this paint by number piece, from kids who are 3 to, people who are older than 3. And they painted these together and they dried and then they wheat pasted them up for Easter Sunday. And so our first service in there, we've got this huge mural.
Yeah.
Which was really...
The first piece of art for this space.
For this space.
Uniquely built for this canvas.
Yeah, and it was like the water flowing. We don't have windows. We do have wood. What can you put on wood? A big piece of art that you wheat paste up. And so we're trying to take our time. Right now, we were trying to figure out how do we get a sign outside. We went, we can just wheat paste posters onto the wood outside. So we've put posters with our church details, like they look like graffiti. But if you go and look, it's our church's information about when we meet and how to find us and who we are. And so we're trying to just sit back and say, what does the building want? So we have these makers nights, which are music, art, and liturgy or writing. And we have these makers nights after church, the third Sunday of the month, where we have musicians and visual artists and writers, and they break off into groups and they're working on things together, and they're asking each other, for this fall, for this sermon series, for Advent this year, what does this building want? And then our hope eventually is to say, how do we invite the city, whether people of faith or not, into this building, which is a living representation of a story that is 2,000 years old, older even before that's root is back in the creation itself. How do we invite people into a building that is telling this story well, where you can touch and taste and see what is good and what is true and what is beautiful? Yeah. So that's what we're trying to figure out.
All right, last question is, tell us about your book. You've written a book.
I have. How much do I say? I had a call this morning with who I think I'm going to sign with, my agent.
Oh,
so that is
okay. A book agent.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which means things are marching forward.
Yeah. So, say what you can. Just tell us maybe you wanted to write a book about...
I wanted to write a book about the story so far of our church. Because really, our church locally is just, we're another church. We're not amazing. We're not stupendous. We're just a local church trying to follow Jesus in some ways that are maybe just a little unconventional. But what we've learned is there are universal elements in what we've experienced that we'd like to share with other churches. And you and I were talking about this earlier. Not so that they can be us, but so they can be them. Yeah. And there are things that we've learned along the way. So it started with just saying, I want to capture this for myself, that I've always had this storytelling itch. Yeah. I've done one-man shows, all this kind of jazz. And I was like, I'd like to write this down just so I can remember it. And if for no one else, I'd give it to my own community so that we know the story, because our story matters in the way that all the good stories matter. And, if I hadn't read those stories, I wouldn't know that we could have church planted. So I started just writing it out, but I really realized quite early on that this is really a story about all of us know what we don't want the church to be, right? Like, we don't want the church to be bitter or holier than thou.
Divisive and hateful and all those
homophobic.
Things.
Like, we don't want the church to be these things. And lots of people then drop out because they don't want to be these things. And lots of people grumble, like they sit in church and they're just angry because they don't want the church to be certain things. Yeah. But then the question is always, so what are you going to be? Okay, we agree what we don't want this to be. What is it going to be? And I realized we had started a church full of people on the edge of faith who knew exactly what they didn't want church and Christianity to look like. But they had to figure out what they wanted it to look like. Right. What does it look like when you then move beyond deconstruction and you say, okay, so let's see what God's building among us. Yeah. And so that's the story. It's really our story over the last 8 years of how God took us from a place of saying, here's what we're not, to, okay, so what are you going to be? Not just for yourselves, but for the sake of the body, the whole church, and for the sake of the city itself. Yeah.
So, people are going to want to, when it's out, and you can tell us what it's called, people will want to find your book. They're going to want to see your YouTube.
It's going to be a while, friends. Yeah, it's at least a year and a half before this thing's published. It's going to take a while.
It's a long journey ahead. Yeah. But where do people find you on the internet?
So if you are on the interweb and you surf on there, you can find me on everything but LinkedIn. I'm Kevin Makins, Makins. So I've mostly been using Instagram lately, but it's owned by Facebook, so they're probably going to screw me later. I don't know. But I've been using, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. But mostly, if you kind of want to just track with me on a regular basis, I'm on YouTube. And it's Kevin Makins. And you can watch Holy Shift on there, which is a 60-minute live tour talk that we did. I did with some friends. We biked city to city and did this talk. And it's about the Bible and why the Bible is violent and messy and still good news. And so that's kind of like a stand-up comedy special meets sermon, less funny, but still not totally boring. And so you can find me on YouTube, and you can go to my website. It's kevinmakins.com. Sweet. You probably know how to use the internet. Find me on there.
People will find you.
Happy to connect.
Yeah, and we'll link it all in the notes too for the show.
Yeah.
Kevin, thanks so much.
Thanks for
hanging
having
out. me on. You are always an entertaining delight to have conversation with.
I'm having a good time
You're
here.
a well of thinking, and there are few who I find that can match me in conversation speed and pivoting to loudness and storytelling. So it's always fun to talk. Thanks.
It's been fun.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that quirky, dynamic, colorful, real conversation we just had with Kevin Makins. I'm sure you're going to want to find him and kind of check out what he's about, what's going on in his church, and what's going on with artists in his community. You can find him at kevinmakins.com. You can find him at instagram.com/kevinmakins. I'm going to, of course, link it in the show notes. You can check out some of his writing, some of his YouTube vlogs. You can check out all things Kevin on his website and on his Instagram. Just an interesting conversation. I hope to continue to provide a few different perspectives and diverse thinking on the arts, creativity, community, communications in the church. And people like Kevin can bring that to us. And so I hope that you check him out and see more of what he's all about. Now, next week on the show, we have a guy from Kevin's church. Actually, his name is Jesse. And Jesse is all about Instagram. His Instagram handle, Jesse Driftwood, is over the top Instagram stories. And so he takes what are these 15-second clips that you can use to tell Instagram stories that disappear after 24 hours. And he goes all out, all in into professional, creative, gorgeous storytelling on the medium of Instagram. And he's using it to reach people. And when he started doing it, he didn't have a ton of people who were checking him out. He was a photographer, filmmaker kind of guy. But since then, he's grown into, I think over 100,000 people are checking him out on Instagram every day and seeing what he's doing with these gorgeous storytelling videos. I think you're going to love that conversation next week with Jesse. Again, we got to sit down live in his studio, and have the conversation in person. And so thanks again for checking out the podcast. Can't wait to see you next week with Jesse. And until then, would you rate, would you subscribe, would you tell your friends, tell somebody about this podcast and spread the word. See you next week.
Thanks for listening to the Word Made Digital podcast with Joanna LaFleur. Head over to joannalafleur.com for more practical tools, interviews, and videos for creatives and communicators. We'd love to help you be the best you can be at communicating the best news in the world. Tap that subscribe button.